On the cold morning of May 19th, 1536, a grim shadow loomed over the Tower of London. The air was thick with whispers, for it was the day Anne Boleyn, the Queen, who had once captured the heart of England's king, was to meet her untimely death. In the days leading up to her execution, Anne had been a prisoner held within the cold, unyielding walls of the Tower, stripped of her dignity and accused of the most heinous crimes. Her downfall wasn't the result of a legal trial based on truth, but rather a political conspiracy orchestrated by those who sought to rid themselves of her influence. On this fateful day, Anne, a woman of remarkable intelligence and presence, dressed herself with grace, wearing a dark gray mantle lined with fur. Her final outfit was both practical and dignified, a striking contrast to the humiliating fate that awaited her. Despite the despair she must have felt, there was a flicker of courage and even dark irony in her words, as she remarked to her ladies, "I have a little neck." She had accepted her fate, yet in her demeanor there was still strength. How did Anne, a woman who had once been the very symbol of royal ambition, come to such a tragic end? She was not only a victim of false accusations, but also of the gendered power dynamics that shaped her world. Her refusal to become Henry VIII's mistress, like her sister Mary Boleyn had, and her insistence on marriage led to a historic break with Rome, reshaping the entire religious landscape of England. Yet despite her revolutionary achievements, she had failed to produce the long-desired male heir. The accusations against her were absurd adultery, with 5 men, including her own brother, and plotting to kill the king. Still, the trial was a mere formality. Anne, with unwavering dignity, defended herself, but her fate was sealed. The finality of her death was marked not by an axe, but a sword wielded by a foreign executioner. Anne's last words were not words of anger or vengeance. She spoke of loyalty to the king, sealing her tragic fate in the eyes of those who would eventually erase her name from history. Her execution, swift and brutal, was not just the death of a queen, but a symbol of the power that was wielded against women who dared to defy the constraints of their time. Anne's story, though silenced for centuries, remains a haunting reminder of the fragility of power and the harsh cost of ambition. Anne Boleyn, once the dazzling star of England's court, stepped forward to face the devastating consequences of a world that had turned against her. A queen who had once revolutionized England, challenging the very foundation of its religious structure, now found herself imprisoned within the Tower of London, accused of crimes she never committed. The whispers of treason and adultery that had surrounded her were nothing more than a carefully orchestrated plot designed to erase a woman who had dared to break the mold. Her death, now etched in history, was not the result of justice, but of political games played by those who feared her influence. For 7 years, Henry VIII had pursued Anne with obsessive passion, breaking with Rome, creating the Church of England, and challenging the Pope, all for the love of a woman. Yet when Anne failed to deliver a male heir to the throne, she became expendable. Her downfall came swiftly, and in an act of unbelievable cruelty, she was arrested, imprisoned, and brought to trial. The accusations were absurd, the trial a mockery of justice, adultery with 5 men, including her own brother, treason, and conspiracy to murder the king. None of these charges held a shred of truth. Anne's defense, poised and dignified, could not save her. With no legal rights, no opportunity to confront her accusers, her fate was sealed. Anne, with quiet grace, accepted the verdict. She was sentenced to die by the sword. But it was in the moments before her death that Anne revealed the true strength of her spirit. With composure and courage, she addressed the crowd not with words of anger or defiance, but with loyalty to the king who had once loved her. Her final words were a political move, a final act of grace aimed at protecting her daughter Elizabeth. Anne's execution was swift and brutal, the sword cutting through her neck with chilling precision, but the cruelty didn't end there. Henry VIII, in his desperate attempt to erase her from history, ordered her name struck from all records and her portraits destroyed. Yet in the years that followed, her daughter Elizabeth I would rise to the throne and become one of the most powerful monarchs in history. Anne's sacrifice, though tragic, laid the foundation for the golden age of England. Anne's story remains one of the most hauntingly tragic and profound in history, reminding us of the power of resilience, the cost of ambition, and the ways in which history is shaped by the women who dare to defy the odds. On that cold gray morning in May 1536, Anne Boleyn, the woman who had once captured the heart of Henry VIII and ignited a revolution in English religion, was led to her death. The Tower of London, a place that once held promises of royal grandeur, had now become her prison. For 7 years, Anne had been the queen who defied the Pope, breaking away from Rome to create the Church of England, all to secure her place as the king's true wife. Yet within the blink of an eye, she had gone from a powerful, charismatic queen to a woman marked for execution, not by any fault of her own, but by the whims of a monarch who had grown tired of her. Her crimes were absurd adultery with 5 men, including her own brother, treason, and conspiracy against the king, charges that seemed more like a cruel plot than reality. Anne, a woman known for her intelligence, charm, and resilience, faced these accusations with grace. Though the trial was a sham and her fate was sealed before she even had a chance to speak, Anne remained composed, dignified, and poised. She did not lash out at her accusers nor beg for mercy. Instead, she made a final statement of loyalty, declaring that Henry VIII had been a good and merciful king. In those final moments, Anne made her peace. She stood before the crowd not as a queen in royal regalia, but as a woman whose life had been upended by the very power that once adored her. With a final prayer, she knelt and the sword fell with precision. Anne Boleyn, once a towering figure in English history, was gone, but not forgotten. Her tragic death was meant to erase her legacy, but in truth it only solidified it. Henry's attempt to destroy her name failed spectacularly. Just 23 years later, Anne's daughter Elizabeth I would ascend to the throne and lead England through its greatest era. Anne's sacrifice, her dignity in the face of certain death, became the foundation upon which Elizabeth's reign was built. Anne's story is a powerful reminder of the price of ambition, the resilience of the human spirit, and the ways in which history, for better or worse, is shaped by those who dare to break the mold. Though her life was short and her death brutal, Anne Boleyn's legacy is one that cannot be erased. The execution of Anne Boleyn remains one of the most haunting and tragic events in English history. On May 19, 1536, the Tower of London stood as a grim backdrop to the end of a queen's life. Anne, the woman who had once been Henry VIII's beloved, and the catalyst for England's religious revolution. From the moment Anne stepped onto the scaffold, she was not just facing her own death, but the ultimate betrayal by a man she had once loved. Anne's fall from grace had been swift and cruel. Once the queen who had defied the Pope, challenging the Catholic Church's authority in order to marry Henry, she now found herself accused of heinous crimes, adultery, incest, and treason. Her trial, a farce orchestrated by her political enemies, was a desperate attempt to strip her of her power and influence. The charges, many of them fabrications, seemed to be born from the king's own fear and frustration, especially his inability to secure a male heir with Anne. In the face of these false accusations, Anne remained dignified and composed. As she made her way to the scaffold, her grace and courage were evident. She spoke kindly of Henry, calling him a good and gentle prince, even as she was unjustly condemned. The public spectacle was chilling. Anne, once radiant in the splendor of royal life, now stood as a woman stripped of her crown, her reputation, and her dignity. The final moments before her execution were marked by an eerie silence as Anne, with her head bowed in prayer, awaited the inevitable. When the executioner raised his sword, Anne's quiet, resolute composure contrasted sharply with the brutality of her fate. A single swift blow separated her head from her body, ending a life that had once burned so brightly in the court of England. Her death, however, was not the end of Anne Boleyn's story. It was a tragedy that gave birth to a legacy that would forever change the course of history. Her daughter, Elizabeth I, would rise to become one of the most iconic and powerful monarchs in English history. Anne's sacrifice, her dignity in the face of unimaginable injustice, laid the groundwork for Elizabeth's reign, an era marked by prosperity, power, and the indelible mark of a mother's influence. Anne's death may have been unjust, but it was also a catalyst that sparked a chain of events that ultimately led to England's golden age. Her life and tragic end remain a testament to the power of resilience and the lasting impact of those who defy the odds, even in the face of ruthless power. On May 19, 1536, Anne Boleyn, once the most powerful woman in England, met her brutal and unjust end at the Tower of London. The woman who had transformed English history by challenging the Pope, by forcing Henry VIII to break from the Catholic Church, and by becoming his second queen, was now condemned to die by beheading, a fate she could not escape, despite her sharp intellect, her dignity, and her beauty. It was a chilling irony that the very man who had once adored her, who had turned an entire nation upside down to marry her, was now the one orchestrating her demise. The accusations against Anne were absurd adultery, incest, and even plotting to murder the king, fabricated by her enemies, with the blessings of a king whose feelings had cooled long before her trial. Henry VIII's failure to produce a male heir with Anne had fueled his growing disdain for her, and her fall from grace was swift and devastating. Anne, once a symbol of power and beauty, was now reduced to a political pawn in a brutal game of ambition and fear. As Anne prepared for her death, her courage was evident. In the face of certain death, she maintained grace and dignity, offering no condemnation, but speaking with quiet reverence of Henry. "Good Christian," she said, "I come here to die according to the law, and therefore I will speak nothing against it." Her last words were a testament to her strength, a final display of loyalty to a man who had condemned her without mercy. The tragic image of Anne walking to her execution, dressed in gray and crimson, still haunts history. She moved with dignity, her head held high, knowing that her life had been stolen, but her spirit was unbroken. The executioner, an expert from France, delivered a swift blow, and Anne's life was ended in a moment of shocking finality. The crowd that gathered remained silent, an uneasy respect hanging in the air as the Queen's body was prepared for burial. Anne Boleyn's death was a moment of profound injustice, but it also marked the beginning of a legacy that would outlive her. Her daughter, Elizabeth I, would ascend to the throne just 23 years later and become one of the most iconic rulers in history. Anne's sacrifice, her tragic end, gave birth to a golden age that shaped the future of England and the world. In death, Anne became a symbol not just of a queen lost too soon, but of a mother whose legacy would forever change the course of history. On May 19, 1536, the Tower of London witnessed one of the most tragic and unjust events in English history. Anne Boleyn, the queen who had once captured the heart of a king and changed the course of a nation, was led to her death. The woman who had once been the symbol of England's defiance of the Catholic Church, who had challenged centuries of tradition and reformed the religious landscape, was now reduced to a prisoner of her own political game. Anne's life, full of ambition and power, had turned to ash in the face of accusations as absurd as they were fabricated. As she stood on the scaffold, Anne's once gilded life had unraveled. A queen to a king who had defied the Pope, she was now seen as a villain. Her crime, the failure to give Henry VIII the son he desperately wanted. Her second miscarriage had sealed her fate, as the king's affection turned cold, and the very same man who had once reformed the kingdom for her love now sought her execution. The accusations of adultery, incest, and treason were all carefully orchestrated by her enemies, chief among them the king's chief minister, Thomas Cromwell. What was once a royal love story had now become a public spectacle of brutality. Despite the grim circumstances, Anne faced her end with a surprising grace. Even as the weight of the charges and the certainty of her doom loomed over her, she maintained her dignity. Anne's final words to the crowd reflected a strength few could understand. "Good Christian, I come here to die according to the law, and therefore I will speak nothing against it." These words, spoken by a woman condemned not for her actions, but for the whims of a king whose love had turned to rage, remain a haunting reminder of the power of loyalty and the strength of character even in the darkest moments. Her execution was swift, but Anne's legacy would not end in that moment. The daughter she had given birth to, Elizabeth I, would rise to become one of the greatest monarchs in history, transforming England into a global power. Anne's death, though cruel and tragic, set the stage for Elizabeth's reign, a reign that would forever alter the trajectory of English history. In that grim silence, as Anne's life was taken, England's future was born. On May 19th, 1536, Anne Boleyn, once the radiant Queen of England, was led to her death, but her tragic fate speaks volumes about the fragility of power and the relentless forces that tear apart those who dare to defy them. This was not just the fall of a queen, it was the shattering of a woman who had dared to challenge centuries of tradition, fought for her love, and revolutionized the English monarchy. Anne's rise from the daughter of a diplomat to the second wife of Henry VIII had been meteoric. She had changed the very course of English history, forcing a break with the Catholic Church and establishing the Church of England, all for the chance to be with a man who swore his love for her. But this same love, once so bright and burning, was what led to her downfall. Anne's inability to provide the longed-for male heir for Henry made her vulnerable especially to the court that once celebrated her rise. The same people who had once cheered her marriage to the king were now poised to tear her down. Her enemies, jealous, envious, and politically motivated, concocted the most absurd charges against her: adultery, incest, and treason. She was accused of betraying the king with 5 men, including her own brother, and conspiring to murder Henry. It was a monstrous set of lies, but the verdict had already been decided long before her trial began. The cruelty of her execution is shocking, but even more so is the dignity with which Anne faced it. She stood tall on the scaffold not as a queen, but as a woman condemned yet still with grace. Her words, spoken with wisdom and loyalty, were a final act of defiance in the face of a kingdom that had turned on her. "I come here to die according to the law," she declared. Her final words were not accusations, but a plea for mercy for the king, a man who had once been her love, and now stood as the very cause of her demise. Anne's death may have sealed her fate, but it also ensured her legacy. Her daughter Elizabeth would rise to greatness, ruling England as one of its most formidable monarchs. In that tragic moment when Anne's life was snuffed out, The future of England was ignited, a symbol of the strength and resilience of a mother's sacrifice. As we come to the end of Anne Boleyn's tragic story, we are reminded that history often holds up those who challenge power and defy the odds. Anne's death was not just the loss of a queen, it was the story of a woman who fought for what she believed in, whose life and death shaped the course of a nation. The real lesson we take from Anne's sacrifice is not just the injustice she suffered, but the legacy that lived on through her daughter Elizabeth I. Despite being condemned, erased from the official records, and unjustly blamed for her own downfall, Anne's courage and intelligence did not fade with her death. In fact, they continued to shape the future of England as Elizabeth became one of the greatest monarchs in history, ruling with power, wisdom, and grace. Anne's story teaches us that power may be fleeting, and that the strongest of us are often brought down by those who fear our influence. Yet even in the face of such tragedy, we can find strength. Just like Anne, we can take pride in standing tall for what we believe, no matter the consequences. Her story reminds us that sometimes the greatest acts of courage are not those that change the world in an instant, but those that build a foundation for a future yet to come. If you found inspiration in Anne Boleyn's story, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell. Let's continue to explore history's untold tales together, where lessons of resilience, justice, and legacy await us.